The evening air in Beverly Hills carried the usual mix of expensive perfume and anticipation, as Hollywood's elite gathered for one of the year's most important charity events. The Beverly Hills Hotel ballroom sparkled with crystal chandeliers, their light dancing across tables decorated with white roses and gold accents. This wasn't just any ordinary night out for the rich and famous. Tonight was about giving back, specifically supporting wounded veterans and their families. Cars worth more than most people's houses lined up outside as valets rushed to park Bentleys, Ferraris, and custom Rolls-Royces. Photographers clustered, behind velvet ropes, their cameras flashing like lightning as celebrities walked the red carpet. The who's who of entertainment had turned out tonight, from A-list actors to powerful directors, all dressed in their finest evening wear. Inside, the ballroom, conversations buzzed with the usual Hollywood mix of business deals, upcoming projects, and carefully crafted small talk. Waiters moved smoothly between groups, offering champagne and expensive appetizers on silver trays. The atmosphere felt electric, the way it always did when this many famous faces gathered in one room. But tonight had an extra layer of meaning. This charity gala wasn't about promoting movies or celebrating awards. It was about honoring the men and women who had served their country, many of whom had paid a heavy price for that service. The organization being supported tonight helped veterans transition back to civilian life, providing job training, mental health support, and assistance for families dealing with the challenges of war injuries. Among the crowd of younger stars and industry executives, one figure stood out simply by being himself. Clint Eastwood had arrived quietly, without fanfare or a large entourage. At over 90 years old, the legendary actor and director still carried himself with the same quiet confidence that had made him a Hollywood icon for more than 6 decades. He wore a simple black tuxedo, perfectly tailored but not flashy. His silver hair was neatly combed, and despite his age, he moved with purpose and dignity. Unlike many of the other celebrities who seemed to float from group to group, always performing for invisible cameras, Eastwood appeared genuinely focused on the evening's charitable mission. Those who knew him weren't surprised by his presence tonight. Throughout his career, Eastwood had been a strong supporter of military causes and veteran organizations. His movies had often featured military themes, and he had always spoken respectfully about those who served. This wasn't a publicity stunt or a photo opportunity for him. This was personal. As cocktail hour continued, Eastwood found himself in conversation with several veterans who had been invited as guests of honor. He listened intently as they shared their stories, asking thoughtful questions and showing genuine interest in their experiences. There were no cameras capturing these moments, no reporters taking notes, just one human being connecting with others who had given so much for their country. The contrast between Eastwood and many of the other celebrities was striking. While others posed for selfies or worked the room for networking opportunities, he seemed content to have meaningful conversations with the people the evening was actually meant to honor. His presence brought a sense of gravitas to the event that went beyond mere star power. At one of the nearby tables, a well-known journalist was holding court with a small group of entertainment reporters and bloggers. This particular journalist had built quite a reputation over the past few years for his confrontational style and his willingness to challenge celebrities on their political views. He was known for creating viral moments, often by putting famous people in uncomfortable situations during what should have been friendly social events. The journalist had been watching Eastwood from across the room, and it was clear that wheels were turning in his head. Here was one of Hollywood's most legendary figures, someone whose political views had sometimes put him at odds with the mainstream entertainment industry. The opportunity for a confrontational interview was too tempting to pass up. What made this situation particularly charged was the current political climate in Hollywood. The entertainment industry had become increasingly polarized, with many celebrities feeling pressure to take public stands on various issues. Those who didn't align with prevailing industry opinions often found themselves marginalized or criticized. Eastwood had never been one to follow trends or worry about what others thought of his views. Throughout his career, he had spoken his mind honestly, regardless of whether his opinions were popular in Hollywood circles. This authenticity had earned him respect from fans around the world. but it had also made him a target for those who disagreed with his perspectives. The journalist began preparing for what he clearly saw as an opportunity to create content that would generate clicks, views, and social media buzz. He signaled to his camera crew, who had been discreetly filming various moments throughout the evening. They began positioning themselves for what appeared to be a planned ambush interview. Other guests started to notice the journalist's preparations. Some seemed uncomfortable with what was obviously about to unfold. This was supposed to be a charity event focused on helping veterans, not a political battleground. But the lure of potentially viral content was too strong for the journalist to resist. Meanwhile, Eastwood continued his conversations with the veterans, completely unaware of what was being planned across the room. He was in the middle of listening to a story from a young soldier who had lost his leg in Afghanistan when he noticed the approaching camera crew out of the corner of his eye. The ballroom's energy began to shift as people sensed something was about to happen. Conversations became quieter, and more guests turned their attention toward the developing situation. The journalist straightened his tie and checked his appearance one final time before beginning his approach. What happened next would become one of those moments that people would talk about for years to come, not because of the confrontation that was about to unfold, but because of how one man's character would shine through in a situation designed to embarrass and diminish him. The veteran Eastwood had been speaking with noticed the change in atmosphere and the approaching cameras. He looked concerned, perhaps sensing that his new friend was about to become the target of something unpleasant. Other veterans at nearby tables also began to pay attention, their protective instincts kicking in as they recognized a potential ambush situation. As the journalist drew closer, his crew positioned their cameras for the best angles. The anticipation in the room was palpable. Everyone knew that Clint Eastwood was not someone who typically backed down from confrontation, but they also knew this was neither the time nor the place for a political showdown. The stage was set for a moment that would reveal the true character of both men involved, and everyone in that ballroom was about to witness something that would stay with them long after the evening ended. The journalist moved through the crowd with the confidence of someone who had done this many times before. His camera crew followed closely behind, their equipment ready to capture what they hoped would be their next viral moment. The soft lighting of the ballroom cast long shadows as they approached their target, who was still engaged in quiet conversation with the veterans at his table. Other guests began to notice the movement across the room. Conversations grew quieter as people sensed something was about to happen. The atmosphere in the ballroom shifted from relaxed charity event to something more tense and uncertain. Some celebrities started pulling out their phones, sensing that they might want to record whatever was about to unfold. Eastwood was in the middle of listening to a story about a veteran's struggle to find work after returning home when he became aware of the approaching camera crew. His experienced eyes immediately recognized what was happening. After decades in Hollywood, he had seen this kind of ambush interview set up countless times. But this was supposed to be a night about helping veterans, not creating controversy. The journalist cleared his throat loudly to get attention. "Excuse me, sir," he said in a voice that carried across several nearby tables. "I wonder if I could have a word with you." His tone was polite on the surface, but there was an underlying edge that suggested this wasn't going to be a friendly chat. Eastwood looked up calmly, his weathered face showing no surprise or concern. He had been dealing with media attention for over 60 years, and very little could catch him off guard anymore. "Sure," he replied simply, his voice steady and controlled. The camera crew moved into position, their equipment now clearly visible to everyone in the immediate area. More guests began to turn their attention toward the developing situation. The veterans at Eastwood's table looked uncomfortable, sensing that their peaceful evening was about to be disrupted. "I'm doing a piece on Hollywood's political landscape," the journalist began, his voice growing louder and more confident as he realized he had captured the attention of nearby tables. "And I think our viewers would be very interested in your perspective on some recent events." What started as a seemingly innocent request quickly took a different turn. The journalist's questions became more pointed and aggressive. He brought up political topics that had nothing to do with the charity event, clearly trying to provoke a reaction that would make for compelling video content. "Don't you think your views are a bit outdated for modern Hollywood?" the journalist pressed, his camera crew capturing every word. "I mean, most people in this industry have moved beyond the kind of thinking you represent." The insult was thinly veiled but unmistakable. Several guests gasped quietly at the journalist's boldness. This wasn't journalism. This was a public confrontation designed to humiliate and embarrass. The veterans at Eastwood's table looked angry, but the veteran actor remained calm and composed. Other celebrities in the room began to gather closer, drawn by the spectacle but also seemingly uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. Some looked embarrassed by the journalist's behavior, while others appeared curious to see how Eastwood would respond to such public disrespect. The journalist, emboldened by the growing audience and the rolling cameras, pushed further. "Your generation just doesn't understand the issues that matter to people today," he continued, his voice now loud enough for half the ballroom to hear. "Maybe it's time for older voices like yours to step aside and let more progressive minds lead the conversation." The attack was becoming more personal and more insulting with each passing moment. The journalist was clearly playing to his cameras and his eventual online audience, not showing any respect for the man he was supposedly interviewing or the charitable cause that had brought everyone together that evening. What made the situation even more uncomfortable was the setting. This wasn't a press conference or a political rally where such confrontations might be expected. This was a charity gala meant to honor veterans and raise money for their support. The journalist's behavior was not only disrespectful to Eastwood, but also to the veterans and their families who were present as guests of honor. One of the veterans at Eastwood's table started to stand up, clearly angered by what he was witnessing. The old soldier had served his country with honor and wasn't about to watch someone disrespect a man who had always shown respect for the military. But Eastwood gently placed a hand on the veteran's arm, silently asking him to remain seated. The journalist continued his verbal assault, bringing up old interviews and past statements, twisting words and taking things out of context to make his points. His camera crew captured every moment, clearly excited by the dramatic footage they were getting. This was exactly the kind of content that would get millions of views and shares across social media platforms. "Your movies always glorify violence and outdated masculine stereotypes," the journalist pressed on, his voice dripping with condescension. "Don't you think you have a responsibility to use your platform more responsibly? To promote more progressive values?" The crowd around them had grown larger, as word spread through the ballroom that something dramatic was happening. Waiters stopped, serving drinks to watch. Other celebrities put down their champagne glasses to focus on the confrontation. Even some of the event organizers had gathered at the edge of the crowd, looking concerned about how this public argument might affect their charity fundraiser. Throughout this entire verbal attack, Eastwood sat quietly in his chair, his hands folded calmly in his lap. His expression remained neutral, showing neither anger nor defensiveness. To those who knew him well, this calm demeanor was not surprising. He had always been a man of few words who preferred action to argument. But his silence seemed to frustrate the journalist, who had clearly expected a more heated response. The lack of reaction was making his aggressive questioning look even more inappropriate and one-sided. Some in the crowd began to shift uncomfortably, realizing they were witnessing what amounted to bullying of a 90-plus-year-old man at a charity event. The journalist's voice grew even louder as he realized he wasn't getting the explosive reaction he had hoped for. "Are you going to answer any of these questions, or are you just going to sit there?" he demanded, his professional facade beginning to slip. "Don't you think the public deserves to know where you really stand on these important issues?" The camera crew continued recording, capturing not just Eastwood's calm response to the attack, but also the reactions of the crowd around them. Many faces showed embarrassment and discomfort at what they were witnessing. This wasn't entertainment. This was a public humiliation attempt that was reflecting poorly on everyone involved. As the journalist prepared to launch into another round of accusations and insults, the entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Everyone sensed that this moment was building towards something significant. What they didn't realize was that they were about to witness a masterclass in dignity and grace under pressure that would leave them all speechless. The tension in the ballroom had reached a breaking point. What started as a charity gala to honor veterans had turned into something completely different. The journalist's voice echoed across the room as more and more people stopped what they were doing to watch the confrontation unfold. The elegant atmosphere of the evening was being replaced by something uncomfortable and raw. Word was spreading quickly through the crowd. Guests who had been at the bar or mingling in other parts of the ballroom were making their way over to see what was happening. The circle of onlookers grew larger by the minute. Some people were recording with their phones, while others just watched in stunned silence. The journalist, seeing his audience grow, became even more aggressive in his questioning. He was clearly feeding off the attention and the drama he was creating. His camera crew adjusted their positions to get better angles of both him and Eastwood, making sure they captured every moment of what they hoped would be their biggest viral hit yet. "You know what I think?" the journalist continued, his voice now carrying across half the ballroom. "I think you represent everything that's wrong with old Hollywood. The toxic masculinity, the outdated political views, the refusal to acknowledge how much damage your generation has done to this industry and this country." Gasps could be heard from several people in the crowd. Even in today's politically charged environment, this level of public disrespect toward a legendary figure was shocking. Some celebrities looked genuinely embarrassed by what they were witnessing. Others appeared angry but unsure of how to intervene. The veterans at Eastwood's table were clearly struggling to contain their anger. These men and women had served their country with honor, and they weren't used to watching someone be attacked so publicly without being able to defend them. One older veteran, his hands clenched into fists, whispered something to his wife that made her place a calming hand on his arm. Throughout all of this, Eastwood remained perfectly still. His weathered hand stayed folded in his lap, his expression unchanged. To anyone who didn't know him, he might have appeared unaffected by the verbal assault. But those who looked closely could see the intelligence in his eyes, the way he was, taking in every word, every gesture, every reaction from the crowd around him. The journalist mistook this calm demeanor for weakness or confusion. He pressed his attack even harder, apparently believing he had his target on the ropes. "Are you even listening to me?" he demanded, leaning closer to Eastwood's table. "Or has age finally caught up with you? Maybe you don't understand what's happening here." This personal attack on Eastwood's age and mental capacity drew audible reactions from the crowd. Several people called out, "Hey," or "Come on," in protest. The journalist had crossed a line that even his supporters in the room found uncomfortable. Attacking someone's politics was one thing, but mocking an elderly person's mental capacity was something else entirely. One of the event organizers, a well-dressed woman who had been watching from the edge of the crowd, started pushing through the circle of onlookers. She looked determined to put an end to this spectacle before it completely ruined the evening and overshadowed the charitable cause they were all supposed to be supporting. But before she could reach the center of the confrontation, the journalist launched into what appeared to be his final assault. He had clearly prepared this attack in advance, and he was determined to deliver it regardless of the setting or the appropriateness of his behavior. "Your movies have always promoted violence as a solution to problems," he declared, his voice now at nearly a shout. "You've made millions of dollars teaching people that shooting first and asking questions later is somehow heroic. Don't you think you bear some responsibility for the violence in our society today?" This accusation struck at the heart of Eastwood's legacy as a filmmaker. His Western and action films had indeed featured violence, but they had also explored complex themes of justice, redemption, and the cost of violence on both the perpetrator and society. To reduce his entire body of work to a simplistic promotion of violence was not just unfair, it was intellectually dishonest. The crowd's reaction was immediate and negative. Even people who might have disagreed with Eastwood's politics recognized that this was a gross oversimplification of his artistic contributions. His films had won Academy Awards and had been studied in film schools around the world for their sophisticated treatment of moral complexity. Several prominent directors in the crowd looked particularly offended by this attack on a fellow filmmaker's artistic integrity. Regardless of political differences, there was a code of professional respect in Hollywood that the journalist was completely ignoring. The journalist, however, was too caught up in his performance to notice the shift in the crowd's mood. He was playing to his cameras and his future online audience, not reading the room he was actually in. His behavior was starting to reflect poorly, not just on him, but on journalism as a profession. And let's talk about your political statements. Over the years, he continued, pulling out his phone as if he had prepared specific quotes to use against Eastwood. You've said things that many people find offensive and outdated. Don't you think it's time to apologize for some of the harm your words have caused? The demand for an apology seemed to be the final straw for many in the crowd. Even people who might have supported challenging Eastwood's political views felt that demanding a public apology at a charity event was going too far. The murmur of disapproval from the audience was becoming more audible. One of the younger actors, in the crowd, someone who had actually worked with Eastwood on a recent film, looked like he was about to step forward and intervene. He had experienced firsthand Eastwood's professionalism and kindness on set, and he couldn't stand watching this public humiliation continue. But just as he took a step forward, something in Eastwood's posture shifted slightly. It was subtle, but those paying close attention noticed that the legendary actor was preparing to respond. After minutes of sitting silently and absorbing this verbal assault, he was finally ready to speak. The journalist, sensing that he might finally get the reaction he had been pushing for, raised his voice even louder. Well, are you going to say something, or are you just going to sit there and prove that you really are too old and out of touch to be relevant anymore? The entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Hundreds of people, from A-list celebrities to event staff, waited to see how one of Hollywood's most legendary figures would respond to this public attack on his character, his work, and his dignity. The moment felt frozen in time. The elegant charity gala had become something none of them had expected to witness, and they were all about to discover that they had underestimated the man sitting calmly at the center of it all. The silence that followed the journalist's final insult was deafening. The entire ballroom seemed frozen, as if someone had pressed pause on the evening itself. Hundreds of people waited, their eyes fixed on the elderly man sitting calmly at his table, wondering how he would respond to such a public attack. Eastwood slowly lifted his head and looked directly at the journalist. His blue eyes, still sharp and clear despite his advanced age, seemed to pierce right through the younger man's aggressive facade. There was no anger in his gaze, no defensiveness, just a quiet intensity that had commanded movie sets and boardrooms for decades. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, yet somehow it carried to every corner of the ballroom. The acoustics of the room, combined with the absolute silence of the audience, meant that his words reached everyone present. "Son," he began, the single word carrying more weight than all of the journalists shouting combined. There was something in the way he said it that immediately changed the entire atmosphere in the room. It wasn't condescending or dismissive. It was almost paternal, like a grandfather addressing a child who had misbehaved. The journalist opened, his mouth to interrupt, but something in Eastwood's expression made him pause. For the first time since the confrontation began, he seemed uncertain about how to proceed. "I've been in this business for over 60 years, Eastwood continued, his voice still quiet but gaining strength. "I've seen a lot of young people come and go. Some of them were talented, some weren't, some were respectful, others weren't. But I've never seen someone work so hard to embarrass themselves in public." A few people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the explosive confrontation they had expected. Instead, it felt like they were witnessing something much more profound. "You came here tonight with your cameras and your prepared questions, thinking you were going to make a fool out of an old man," Eastwood said, his weathered hands still folded calmly in his lap. "But the only person you've made a fool of tonight is yourself." The journalist's face began to redden. He clearly hadn't expected this kind of response. He had prepared for anger, for political arguments, for the kind of heated exchange that would make good television. He hadn't prepared for this quiet dignity that was making him look smaller with every passing second. "You want to talk about my generation?" Eastwood asked, his voice carrying a hint of steel now. "Let me tell you something about my generation. We learned that respect isn't something you demand, it's something you earn. We learned that if you want to be treated like a professional, you act like one." Several people in the crowd nodded unconsciously, even those who might have disagreed with Eastwood's politics found themselves moved by his words. "You stand there with your cameras, attacking an old man at a charity event meant to honor veterans," he continued. gesturing slightly toward the veterans still seated at his table. These men and women sacrificed for their country. They deserve better than to have their evening turned into a circus for your social media followers. The mention of the veterans hit home with many in the audience. They had all come here tonight to support a good cause, and somehow that had been forgotten in the drama of the confrontation. "You want to know what's wrong with today's world?" Eastwood asked, his voice growing slightly stronger. "It's not old people with outdated views. It's young people who think disrespect is the same thing as courage, who think being loud is the same thing as being right." The journalist tried to regain control of the situation. "Now wait a minute," he started to say, but Eastwood held up one weathered hand, and somehow that simple gesture commanded more authority than all of the younger man's shouting. "I'm not finished," Eastwood said simply, and the journalist fell, silent again. "You came here tonight looking for a fight," the veteran actor continued. "You wanted me to get angry, to say something you could twist and use against me. But I'm not going to give you that satisfaction. Because I learned a long time ago that the measure of a man isn't how he acts when he's trying to impress people. It's how he acts when he thinks nobody's watching." The camera crew, who had been so eager to capture drama, now seemed unsure whether they should continue filming. Their equipment felt intrusive in the face of such quiet dignity. "You talk about my movies promoting violence," Eastwood said, his voice taking on a slightly different tone. "But if you had actually watched them instead of just reading about them online, you might have noticed that the real heroes in my films are the ones who try to avoid violence. The ones who understand that pulling a trigger is easy, but living with the consequences is hard." Several directors in the crowd nodded knowingly. They understood the deeper themes in Eastwood's work that the journalist had completely missed. "And you want to talk about outdated views?" Eastwood asked, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Let me tell you what's really outdated. It's the idea that you can build yourself up by tearing others down. It's the belief that being cruel is the same thing as being clever." The words hung in the air like a gentle rebuke that somehow carried more power than any angry outburst could have. "I've lived through a lot of changes in this world," Eastwood continued. "I've seen technology advance, I've seen society evolve, I've seen young people challenge old ideas, and sometimes they've been right to do so. But some things never change. Respect, dignity, treating others the way you want to be treated. These aren't outdated concepts. They're timeless ones." The journalist looked around the room, perhaps finally realizing that the crowd was no longer on his side. What had started as what he thought would be a supportive audience for his confrontational interview had turned into a room full of people who were clearly moved by Eastwood's response. "You know what I've learned in all my years?" Eastwood asked, his voice becoming almost conversational now. "The people who demand respect the loudest are usually the ones who deserve it the least, and the people who quietly earn it never have to ask for it." He paused for a moment, looking directly at the journalist with what could only be described as compassion. "Son, you're clearly a talented young man. You wouldn't be here tonight if you weren't. But talent without character is just noise, and tonight you've made a lot of noise, but you haven't said anything worth hearing." The silence that followed these words was different from the tense quiet that had preceded them. This was a respectful silence, the kind that follows something profound and true. The journalist stood there, his prepared follow-up questions suddenly seeming pointless and petty. He had come to this event planning to create a viral moment at Eastwood's expense, but instead he had become the subject of a masterclass in grace under pressure that no journalism school could have prepared him for. The aftermath of Eastwood's response was unlike anything anyone in that ballroom had ever witnessed. The journalist stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, clearly struggling to process what had just happened. All his prepared comebacks and follow-up questions seemed to have evaporated in the face of such unexpected wisdom and grace. His camera crew looked equally stunned. They had come expecting to capture an explosive confrontation, the kind of heated argument that would rack up millions of views online. Instead, they had recorded something entirely different, a masterclass in dignity that had left their boss looking small and foolish. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. You could hear the soft clink of ice in glasses and the distant sound of traffic outside. But inside the ballroom, hundreds of people remained perfectly still, absorbing what they had just witnessed. Then, slowly, something remarkable began to happen. An older gentleman near the back of the crowd began to clap. It started as a slow, respectful applause, the kind you might hear at a graduation ceremony or a memorial service. Within seconds, others joined in. The sound grew and spread throughout the ballroom like ripples on a pond. The applause wasn't wild or enthusiastic. It was something deeper than that. It was the sound of people recognizing that they had just witnessed something rare and genuine in a world that often felt fake and manufactured. They were applauding not just Eastwood's words, but the values he had demonstrated: respect, dignity, and grace under pressure. The journalist looked around the room, finally understanding that his plan had backfired completely. The crowd that he had hoped would support his confrontational approach was now clearly on Eastwood's side. Some people were even looking at him with what could only be described as pity. His cameraman quietly stopped recording and began packing up his equipment. There was no point in continuing. What they had captured wasn't the gotcha moment they had planned for. It was evidence of their own poor judgment and lack of professionalism. As the applause continued, Eastwood slowly stood up from his chair. Despite his age, he moved with quiet confidence, acknowledging the crowd's response with a simple nod. He wasn't basking in their approval or trying to extend the moment. He had said what needed to be said, and now he was ready to move on. Veterans at his table also stood, forming a protective circle around the legendary actor. These men and women who had served their country with honor clearly recognized a kindred spirit, someone who understood the value of doing the right thing even when it wasn't easy. One of the younger veterans, a woman who had lost her arm in combat, reached out and gently touched Eastwood's shoulder. "Thank you," she said quietly, her words meant for him alone but somehow carrying to the people nearby. "Thank you for standing up for all of us tonight." Eastwood's response was characteristically simple. He just nodded and said, "Thank you for your service," but the way he said it, with genuine respect and gratitude, made it clear that these weren't just empty words to him. The journalist, meanwhile, was trying to salvage something from the situation. He attempted to restart his confrontational questioning, but his voice lacked the confidence it had carried earlier. "Wait, we're not finished here," he called out, but his words seemed to fall flat in the changed atmosphere of the room. Several celebrities who had been watching began to approach Eastwood, clearly wanting to show their support. But he gently waved them off, not wanting to turn the moment into another spectacle. He had made his point, and he wasn't interested in prolonging the drama. Instead, he turned his attention back to the veterans at his table, resuming the conversations that had been interrupted by the journalist's attack. His message was clear. The real heroes of the evening were these men and women who had served their country, not the celebrities and media figures who were just there to support them. The event organizers, who had been worried that the confrontation would overshadow their charitable mission, found that the opposite had happened. Eastwood's response had actually refocused everyone's attention on the real purpose of the evening. People began talking about the veteran stories and the important work the charity was doing. Donations that had been pledged earlier in the evening were quietly increased. Several celebrities who had been planning to leave early decided to stay and spend more time talking with the veterans. The journalist's attack had inadvertently created a stronger sense of purpose and community among the attendees. The journalist himself seemed to realize that his presence was no longer welcome. He gathered his crew and began making his way toward the exit, but not before several people in the crowd made it clear what they thought of his behavior. The looks he received ranged from disappointed to disgusted. As he reached the door, one of the veterans called out to him. "Son," the old soldier said, using the same word Eastwood had used earlier, "next time you want to pick a fight with someone, maybe choose someone who deserves it." The journalist's face reddened again, but he didn't respond. He simply left, his camera crew trailing behind him like guilty children. Back at the veterans' table, Eastwood was listening to another story, this one about a young soldier who had started a nonprofit to help other veterans find jobs. His attention was completely focused on the speaker, as if the confrontation had never happened, but the impact of what had occurred was still rippling through the room. People were sharing their thoughts about what they had witnessed, and the consensus was clear. They had seen something special. In an age of social media outrage and manufactured controversy, they had witnessed authentic grace and dignity. Several young actors approached the veterans' table, not to talk to Eastwood, but to hear the stories of the men and women who had served. The journalists' attempt to create division had instead brought people together around something more important than celebrity gossip or political arguments. As the evening wound down, the charity announced that they had exceeded their fundraising goal by a significant margin. The confrontation, rather than damaging the event, had actually inspired people to give more generously to support veterans and their families. When Eastwood finally prepared to leave, he did so as quietly as he had arrived. No grand exit, no final statements to the media. He simply thanked the veterans for sharing their stories, shook hands with the event organizers, and walked toward the door. But as he left, something had changed in that ballroom. The people who had witnessed his response to such public disrespect had learned something valuable about character, dignity, and the power of choosing grace over anger. The story of what happened that night would be told and retold for years to come. Not because of the journalist's aggressive questioning, but because of how one man's quiet dignity had transformed an ugly moment into something beautiful and meaningful. In a world that often rewards the loudest voice, they had been reminded that sometimes the most powerful response is the quietest one. Sometimes the best way to win an argument is to rise above it entirely.